started. I want to thank everybody for coming back out. This is the fourth of our series of speakers. We started back in January. We'll be taking a break over the summer and starting up again in September. And tonight we have for us Professor Valerie Murrenus Pilmaier, Professor of English and Literature here at UW-Sheboygan. And she will be talking about Irish literature, I guess Irish women's literature specifically.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Valerie.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so my dissertation was on an Irish author whose name is Patrick McCabe, and he writes sort of gruesome thriller-type novels, and I looked at it through the lens of trauma theory. So Irish literature has always been my subject. I'm also my subject is also British literature and the novel, from the origins to the present day. I got interested in the topic of Irish Chiclet because, as a scholar of literature, Chiclet is sort of at the bottom of the barrel in terms of research. You're not supposed to really do any criticism on certain types of literature. So horror would be one of those types of literature. Romance novels are another types of those literature because they're not highbrow, right? So in literary criticism, there's this type and then there's this type. And Irish Chiclet is sort of this type, right? So I was given a book by Marion Keyes when I was pregnant with my son 5 years ago. And my friend had said, oh, just read it, it's really easy, it's really cute, and then you can just throw it away. Okay, so that's sort of the whole critical reception about Irish Chiclet and Chiclet in general. It's the same thing if you think about a chick flick. People are very dismissive of it. Well, it's just a chick flick. You know, you don't have to think about it. You just go and then you cry and you laugh and whatever, and then you just forget about it. And I was thinking about this because there are over 1 billion Chiclet books that are sold every year. 1 billion. And if you think about how many literature books are sold each year, that number is minuscule in comparison. So there's something happening. There's something going on. And I tend to think when you have these big phenomena where so many people are reading a particular genre of literature, there's something going on. You got to try to figure out what's going on here. So that's where the genesis of this came from.
Can I interrupt real quick?
Yeah.
I don't know what you mean by Chiclet.
You're going to find out. Okay. So one of the things that we need to talk about what all these different definitions are. And as Mark had said, you know, what does Chiclet mean? And we're going to get to that. But one of the things that I want to talk about, just in terms of Irish literature in general, is there is a legacy in terms of Irish writers of the weight of James Joyce. And anybody who knows anything about Irish literature knows Joyce, right? You'll be like, oh, Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, right? And it's usually something you don't want to read, something that you pretend like you have read. Oh, well, yes, I read The Wake. And no, you didn't. You didn't read it. I know you didn't read it because I've read it, and I never want to read it again, okay? So James Joyce is, he is a master storyteller, and he's a genius, and his writing is amazing, but that doesn't mean that other writing isn't just as amazing. But this has been every single Irish author who has come out of Ireland since James Joyce has been writing has talked about the weight of his legacy on them. Another thing that we need to talk about is, just in terms of Irish literary circles, in Ireland, it's a privileged position to be an author. And they have a different tax bracket. Irish authors do not pay taxes. So people come to Ireland and they do work there as an author, and they have a special status as an author. So it's an enormous privilege to be an author in Irish society. You get a lot of different breaks that other people don't get. Within the scope of Irish authors, it has been predominated by men. And there's a huge controversy in terms of the Irish canon of literature because, for the most part, women have been ignored in terms of being recognized for being Irish. Every once in a while, you'd find a smattering of women that would be included in an anthology. But for the most part, it was overwhelmingly male. So in the late 1980s, there was a compilation, a 3-volume compilation of Irish writing called the Field Day Anthology of Irish Writing, and not one woman was included. Not one. So there was a huge controversy. And the Field Day people sort of got their chops about them, and they came out with a volume 4 that was women's Irish writing. And it was difficult to find because typically in Irish society, the woman's place was in the house and the man's place was outside of the house, right? So for women to break out and become writers, there had to be special circumstances, like an enormous amount of money, or just a lot of leisure, or you had to be a widow, or there were other avenues that were available to men that weren't available to women. So just the number of women who are writing in Ireland is very, very low until after World War II, when everything started to change. So if you look here, you can see there are all of these Irish male writers, from Jonathan Swift all the way to W.B. Yeats. And I just have her because she's cute. So. Yeah. Okay, so this is the first page of Ulysses. And as I was talking about before, that legacy of James Joyce is huge. Ulysses is the novel continuation of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and that sort of was extended from his book of short stories that was called Dubliners. So this is what we're looking at when we're thinking about what is this legacy of writing. And as you can just see looking through this, there's an enormous amount of Catholicism that's steeped in this. There's sort of inside jokes. There's a sense of almost elitism. There are certain things that you can write about in literature that you don't write about, or that entertainment doesn't consult. And so Ulysses is about a young man who it's a Bildungsroman, so he is becoming an artist. And that's what that's about. Now here's Finnegan's Wake. I just want you to take a look at this. Try to make some sense of this, because I don't think you can, because most people can't. Now, the whole thing with Finnegan's Wake is Joyce always called it a work in progress. And it's an experiment. And it's an experiment in writing, and it's an experiment in sound. You're supposed to read it out loud. You're supposed to be able to hear. There's a lot of onomatopoeia and alliteration, and you're supposed to get visuals. But it's not supposed to be a story. In a way, a story is a story. So one of the reasons why Finnegan's Wake is so famous is because it's so nonsensical. It's really, really difficult to try to figure out what it means. And you're not even supposed to read it from the first page. You're supposed to read it starting in chapter 6, and then you have to go to chapter 2, and then you have to go to chapter 11, and then you have to go to chapter 1. But you don't know this the first time you read it, so you're like, oh my God, what's going on? But this is supposed to be a genius, right? If you were going to write something like this as your first novel, it would never get published. And if you would write something like this and you weren't a superstar in terms of writing these days, it would not get published, right? It was a special time and a special place, but this is a big legacy to live up to because, just because. Okay, so that brings us to the concept of what's literature and what's entertainment. And this is something I talk about every semester with my literature students. And in order to sort of understand why do we study literature, you have to differentiate it from entertainment. So if I would pose that question to you, what's the difference between literature, what's the difference between entertainment, what would your answer be? Literature can be entertainment. But there is a difference between the two of them, right? What do you think?
I would say that literature deals with bigger themes and issues, whereas entertainment is really just something to break out at the beach and relax with.
That's exactly it, right? So literature is supposed to be looking at the human experience, helping you understand what it means to be a human, what it means to go through different experiences in your life. How do other people deal with things? How do you think about situations that occur? That's why in literature, when you think about it, there are oftentimes the focus of not very nice things in literature, right? It's not happy endings all the time. Most of the time, it's a weird ending or no ending or an unhappy ending. Because in real life, you don't have very many happy endings, right? Watching somebody else go through a situation helps you to deal with it vicariously through them. And that's the whole point of literature, to help you become a better person, to help you understand other human beings, to help you understand yourself. Entertainment, like, for example, a reality show. You can watch it, you can eat your popcorn, you can laugh, and then it's over. It doesn't stay with you, but literature is supposed to stay with you. It can become a part of who you are, right? So that's the difference. And the two pictures that I have up here I think are important. This one is, it's a statue of famine victims that's in Dublin. It's on the quays in Dublin. And a lot of Irish literature focuses on this very topic, because the famine looms so large in the Irish consciousness. It's a part of every person that lives in Ireland, and it's just a part of who they are. But this would just be entertainment, right? Like, blah, Girls Gone Wild sort of thing. Okay, so I think this is one of the things that we need to think about is intention. One of the differences between literature and entertainment is what are you hoping to do with it, right? If you're an artist, you're going to write literature. You're trying to get a big message out. If you're writing entertainment, it's just because it's fun. You write a good story, and then you're hoping to sell a lot of books, right? There's a difference in intention. And Maeve Binchy has been compared to James Joyce, William Butler Yeats. She has been compared to Oliver Goldsmith, Jonathan Swift. These huge biggies of Irish literature, like the biggies of Irish literature. And she herself thought that was ridiculous. Because as you can see, she was like, I write for people who are in an airport, okay? Like, I can tell a pretty good story, but I'm not thinking this is going to change your life, right? And I think that that's one of the things that we need to think about. I'm not trying to persuade anybody tonight that this is high literature. I'm not trying to suggest that this is going to change anybody's life by reading it. However, that doesn't mean there isn't something important that it has to tell us. Okay, so Mark, anticipating that, the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of chiclet is pretty generalized, right? It's by women, for women, about women's topics. And if we think about it, if you think about the history of women's literature, that is really generalized, but it encompasses every single woman, for the most part, that has been writing, except for a few. So one of the things that we need to think about is the struggle that women have had in terms of getting their writing read by a reading public. So we can, in feminist circles, especially when talking about Chiclet, they tend to go back to Jane Austen and say Jane Austen was the first Chiclet writer, which is true in a way if that's your definition. It also has to do with intention, I guess. What was her intention? Her intention wasn't to tell a really funny, silly, titillating story, but it was to talk about women's lives. And that's exactly what Chiclet does. It talks about women's lives in a way that is sort of like being in an inner circle. Okay? So if you assume that your audience is going to be comprised of people that understand your life situation, you talk differently. You say different things. Do you know what I mean? If you're thinking that you're talking to a group of people that have no conception of anything that you've experienced in your life, your vocabulary is going to change, the focus is going to change, everything's going to change. So one of the things that differentiates Chiclet from other types of literature is this sense of insularity, right? So you're a part of a group. It's a special group, and it's different from other people. So that you can say things, you can do things in a different way than you would to any other type of audience. Okay, so we were talking about that anxiety that, that women had in Irish society about there are so few women writers. There are so few women writers in Irish society at a certain point that were women, so they had to write like men. They felt that they had to write the same types of topics that men were writing. Okay, so the big literature stuff. And the focus was more on the big literature stuff, right, instead of the small, more mundane things. And we see that has translated into Chiclet criticism. So big heavyweights of literature like Doris Lessing, she hates Chiclet, and she has come out and she's called it froth and a waste of time, and she has said, if you're going to read something, read literature. Don't read this other stuff because it's a waste of time. Well, one of the problems is most people don't have time to devote to literature, right? Because it's hard, it's difficult, it takes time to get through it. You have to think about it. Most people maybe have 10 minutes at the end of their day where they can read it before they go to bed. And they don't want to think about, you know, these huge life and death issues. They would rather just wrestle with someone's seemingly smaller problems, right? However, I think that this is a little mean-spirited, right? Because it's this idea that it's completely not worthwhile. And it really sets up a paradigm where Chiclet is revolting and stupid and trash, and other types of literature are good. One of the problems that we've talked about in feminist circles is that female authors who are writing literature should be kinder to people who are writing other types of literature, because you're sort of all in the same group. You're doing different things, but you should be embracing of what other people are doing. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's different, right? Okay, so what's the difference between Irish Chiclet and romance? Well, this is from the American Romance Association's website, and I had to put Fabio up there just because otherwise it wouldn't be complete. So the thing that differentiates romance from Chiclet is that the relationships are rewarded with emotional justice and unconditional love at the end. There's always a happy ending. Chiclet doesn't have that. Okay, which makes it more like regular literature than it does like a romance. The use of the term Chiclet is pejorative, right? So the word chick in and of itself has different connotations. Sometimes it can be positive, sometimes it can be negative, depending on the way that it's used. The term lit, not literature, means that it's condensed, it's not as good as, right? So Chiclet together would seem like it's pejorative, but just like with queer theory, that word has been taken over and it has become a positive instead of a negative, depending on the context. Okay, so the thing that differentiates it is that you have that one type of storyline for the romance plot, but in Chiclet, you're looking at women's lives from all kinds of different angles. So you would think it would just be fluffy and fun and sweet and frothy, but it's not. Because one of the things that's happened since Chiclet has been evolving, it really did start out with Helen Fielding's Bridget Jones' Diary. It was 1996. And that was sort of the beginning of it. And that, I mean, it's a ripoff of Jane Austen, so that's why they like to go back and say Jane Austen is the first Chiclet writer, which there's a lot of contention about that. But now we have Chiclet novels that look at rape, that look at domestic abuse, that look at violence, different types of violence. So there's all different topics that are finally being broached with this. It's almost as if they feel like they've gotten to a safe place because they've established a readership, and now they can talk about more weighty topics. Okay, so then there's some particular genre characteristics of Irish Chiclet that differentiate it from regular Chiclet, because the genre of Irish Chiclet is based in Irish society, right? Irish society has very specific parameters that that it functions upon. And one of the parameters is the position of women in Irish society. So if any of you are Irish, you might know the special position of women in the Irish Constitution. Do any of you know that? Okay, so in the Irish Constitution in 1922, which, by the way, gave the right to women to vote before any of the other countries, before England, before the United States gave women the right to vote. But women were given the right to vote, but they were also given a special space in the Irish Constitution as mothers. So it says in the Irish Constitution that a woman is privileged because she is a mother. And it creates a problem where women who aren't mothers are sort of infantilized, and they're not considered to be really women until they become mothers. So it's an interesting juxtaposition, because on one hand the idea is if you're a mother, you are really important and you need to be protected, and so they give monetary compensation to mothers who need it, right? So we have a situation in Ireland today where we have a lot of unwed mothers who are getting compensated from the government because they have this special situation in the Constitution. But at the same time, it's created problems because in Irish society, women were sort of put on pedestals, but they were also considered second-class citizens. They could vote, but they were always behind their husbands. They were sort of the silent partner in terms of everything that was going on. So, for example, women were not given the right to their children in divorces up until very recently. Women were not allowed to be on a jury until the 1990s. Women were not They could not charge their husbands with rape until the 1990s. There was a lot going on in Irish society where women were just really sort of under the radar. What is really important, I think, in terms of sexuality in Irish Chiclet is there's a different voice that comes out in terms of how to talk about sexuality than had been brought about before. So if any of you have read Ulysses, people make light of the final chapter in Ulysses, which is called Penelope. Does anybody know anything about the Penelope chapter? And what do you know about the Penelope chapter? Right.
It's sexy.
It is sexy, but the thing about it is, I'll just tell you what it is. So Penelope is Leopold Bloom's wife, and Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus are the two main characters, and they're like Ulysses and his son in, oh my God, in Ulysses, I guess, right? And Penelope is the mother figure, and in the final chapter of Ulysses, one of the reasons why Ulysses was banned when it came out is because it's very sexually explicit, and in it, Penelope is talking about, Molly Bloom, is talking about all of these things that she would do sexually with all these different men and blah, 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 and it was really kind of saucy. However, it isn't realistic to a woman's point of view. It's very much what a man thinks a woman thinks about when she's by herself. So the images are very gratuitous, and they're also completely bizarre. So if you're bored one night, go and read it. You might get a good chuckle out of it, particularly if you're a woman, because you're thinking, oh, so this is what James Joyce thinks that women think about, or hopes that women think about. But it isn't very realistic in terms of how women actually think about sexuality. So one of the things that is really important about Irish Chiclet is that it forces us to see what real women think about sexuality in Irish society, in Irish culture. And it's pretty salacious, but in a really funny way. Very denigrating way. Like, this is really silly, and I'm really fat in these underpants, but I don't care because this is what I'm thinking about, and blah, blah, blah. It's very Irish in terms of humor. I don't know if any of you know anything about Irish humor, but they love to poke fun at themselves. Like, they just will rip on themselves and rip on themselves and rip on themselves, and they think that's fantastic. If any of you have ever seen Father Ted, this is a quintessential Irish comedy show. You should check it out. It's really funny. Okay. One of the other things that's really interesting about Irish Chiclet is in Ireland, because women have been put under the radar for such a long time, they have a great deal of difficulty dealing with all the tenets of feminism. So it feels like Irish women are sort of hurtling into the future, hurtling into progression, right? So it's really fastward moving, because Irish women have very recently been getting a lot of rights that other women have been getting sort of piecemeal, right? But they're all hitting Irish women at once, and they don't know what to do, because there's sort of a clash. I'll be right with you. There's sort of a clash between the traditional roles that Irish women would inhabit, which would be in terms of the home, wife, mother, daughter, pretty silent about issues in terms of the home. And then we have the idea of having all the responsibility, making all of the decisions, not falling back on what you had known before. And it's really confusing for a lot of Irish women, and that's something that comes out. Yes?
Do you know why is that happening? What social factors produce all that reign of rights? I know for most of Europe and the United States, it was World War II. The guys were to fight, and women took over positions of working, and then they discovered independence, and they began to fight for more rights.
Yeah, that didn't happen in Ireland, because Ireland wasn't in the war.
But what happened?
Right. So one of the things that is important to know is Northern Ireland was in the war, right? Because it was a part of England, but the Republic of Ireland was not. So in terms of all of those rights, those came much later for Irish women, because there wasn't that urgency. They didn't have that sense of, we had gone and taken over for the men, so we can still do it, right? What had happened was Ireland had joined the EU, and all of the other European countries were giving all these rights to women. And they were saying, listen, you have to do this for Irish women, because they're lagging behind. And if you're going to be a part of this, then you're going to do this too. And so it was sort of kicking and screaming that they brought them up to having the rights that the other European Union women had. And if you're not ready to have those types of things happen, it's really confusing. Confusing for men, it's confusing for women, it's confusing for everyone, right? So we have a situation where we have the old school of older Irish people, and they're not used to all of these rights, but the people that are born into that have no idea how to understand the older people. So it's this big clash that's happening. Excellent question. Okay, so what's happening in Ireland in 1960? And the reason why I picked 1960 is because that's when The Country Girls by Edna O'Brien came out. It was huge, and we'll talk about that. So as I said, in 1922, all women and men over the age of 21 are given the right to vote. That's a huge, huge thing. Huge, huge, huge thing. In 1932, we see that in the law, you have to lose your job if you are a civil servant or a national school teacher if you get married. And what would happen is they were given a pay packet when they got married. The day that they got married, they were given a big check. Like, give this to your husband, because this will help you. And they just couldn't have a job. Article 41 of the Irish Constitution is what I was talking about, the special place of mothers. At this time, anyone who had an illegitimate baby, or they were considered too beautiful, or they were considered too unruly, they were considered fast, would be put into places of confinement called Magdalen homes. Some of you might know of these because of the Magdalen sisters. It was a Irish movie that had come out a couple of years ago. These didn't close until 1996. Sinead O'Connor was actually put into a Magdalen home. Yeah. What would happen when you would go into that is that you would never be guaranteed when you'd get out. You might never get out. And you didn't even have to have an illegitimate baby to be put into it. Your family could decide that it was a place for you to go because you were causing trouble. Girls that were molested, victims of incest, were put into these homes. The girls were taken out of the home instead of the father taken out of the home, because the girls were considered the trouble. So there are a lot of things going on. Yeah?
I remember there was a lot of, I don't remember the word, kind of criticism or surprise that they discovered after a while that some of those Magdalena homes were trafficking with children.
Right.
They were the maids that run those houses would rape them, and they would
Right.
have babies, and they would traffic with the babies. And
Right.
it was a non-drive black organization.
Right. So actually, all of the places of confinement, there were places, they're called industrial schools for boys, and the Magdalene homes for girls, and those were all orphans would go to, or troubled kids, or whatever. And it broke about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, that they were trafficking sites. So these children were used as sexual objects by these people, and it's a huge problem. I mean, it's a huge problem. The sexual abuse scandal with the Catholic Church broke in Ireland before anywhere else. So, I think it's important just to note that legal adoption wasn't the case until 1952 in Ireland, because we had this. So those babies would be taken out and they would be given to people, but it wasn't actual legal adoption. So what would happen is people would have these illegitimate babies and they'd use them as servants, but they didn't have them as like family members in their houses. Contraception, of course, and abortion are illegal at this time, and 26.4% of women are employed in 1961, but it's hard to determine how many were married and unmarried. I was looking at the European Commission report about the status of women in Ireland, and that's their number. But I've seen other numbers where it said only 6% of married women at this time were working outside of the home. So it was very uncommon. So that brings us to The Country Girls by Edna O'Brien. And this was banned when it came out in Ireland in 1960. And the reason that it was banned is because it had a girl who was having a relationship with a married man, and they were naked with each other. Nothing ever happened. They didn't consummate their relationship, but they stood naked next to each other in a living room, and that freaked everybody out. Like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? That's crazy, oh my God. And so it was banned. It's so weird. Like, it's just such a, okay, so the premise of this book is there's this girl whose name is Kathleen Brady, and she comes from a really troubled household. Her father's an alcoholic. Her mother is really beaten down and abused. Her mother ends up dying while she's on an adulterous tryst with this man who has a bunch of kids. So just from the very beginning of this book, it talks about all these taboos in Irish society that you do not talk about. You did not talk about alcoholism. You did not talk about adultery. You did not talk about abuse. And it starts the book that way. So 1960. So we watch a girl who has no self-esteem, no sense of self, nobody to protect her, trying to make her way through the world. And she makes all these horrible choices, just absolutely horrible choices. She's very smart. She ends up going on scholarship to a convent school. And she has this friend who's really not very smart, but really gregarious. And they get kicked out because they make up this dirty note about a nun and a priest. And then she goes to Dublin with her friend, and she gets a job. And in the interim, there's this man in their town who is like, she's 14 years old when he starts showing interest in her, and he's like 55. And yeah, so it's really ooky, creepy, not nice. And he keeps pursuing her, and she's very nervous, and she's very naive, and she doesn't know what she's doing. And then at the very end of the book, he like persuades her to take off all of her clothes at the house that she's living in, and anybody could come in at any point. He takes off all of his clothes. It's gross. Anyway, it's not good. The key, though, is she doesn't have any agency in this book. She doesn't have any gumption. She doesn't have any say. She doesn't give herself any chance to speak against anything that's happening to her. She's always acted upon. She doesn't act. And this book, I think, is really important as a starting point for looking at Irish Chiclet, because it shows us where women were in society at this time, right? It is not a factual representation, it's fictional, but it's also showing us the strictures that were around Irish women at this time. They had no recourse, they had nothing, especially if they didn't have a family that was there to protect them. So at the end of this book, she's running around aimless and pathetic, and you just sort of want to shake her, but you can't, and there it is. Okay, so that brings us to Maeve Binchy, whose book Light a Penny Candle came out in 1982. And in 1982, a lot of things had changed in Irish society. So we had the Irish Women's Liberation Movement, which was trying to get everybody on track in terms of what's going on in the other European countries. So they joined the EU in 1973. We have these other things that are formed, the Council for the Status of Women. We had the lifting of the marriage ban in employment, which was when you had to lose your job because you were in civil service, right? Finally, we can have contraceptives available by prescription, and we had paid maternity leave of up to 14 weeks. So things are starting to change. Everything is starting to change. It feels like there's more momentum giving more rights to women. And we can see that represented in this book. So this is what it looks like. Let me go back once. So in this book, how many of you have read this? Can you tell me, can you give me a synopsis of Light a Penny Candle?
I've read almost all of her books.
Okay.
And I just know she has such good character
Okay.
development. I feel they're very strong characters.
They are. Do you remember, Karen? Okay, so this is a really interesting book because it was written in 1982, but it harkens back to the 1940s. And it's about a girl who's British, whose name is Elizabeth, and she goes to live in Ireland during the war with her mother's Irish friend, and the little girl's name is Aisling. Okay, and so they have this big Irish family, and it's this idyllic pastoral place, and Ireland's so great because you can have butter and sugar, and it's so great, and you can eat, and everybody's so nice, and they love each other, and England, everybody's really cold and sour, and they all hate each other, and it sucks, and it's terrible, and bleh. So Binchy creates this situation where Ireland is sort of perfect, and England is not perfect. So anything that's going to go wrong in the book is going to happen pretty much in England. Anything that's going to be good is going to happen in Ireland. And that is not a mistake. Okay, so that's a conscious choice on the part of the author to show that Ireland is an important place. Ireland is a good place. What's happening in Ireland at this time is we have high unemployment overall. People are starting to emigrate at larger numbers out. And Maeve Binchy felt it was really important to show what were the positives of Ireland, and she demonstrated that in Light a Penny Candle. Now, something that's really interesting about this book is both of the characters get married. One of the characters has an abortion before she gets married, which is crazy because abortion was not legal in England at this time either. Okay, so the woman, one of the women in the books, gets an abortion in like 1957, and it wasn't legal in England until 1969. So there's sort of an anachronism that's happening. And at the end, both women have their husbands die off very conveniently, and then the ladies go off and live in their own utopian female paradise by themselves, which is a really interesting ending if you compare that to the Country Girls, right? So in the Country Girls, there is no happy ending for the main character of Kathleen. She just sort of wanders aimlessly looking for somebody who's going to marry her. And this one, it's saying, we don't need to be married, right? We're women, we're strong, we can do whatever we want, and that's fabulous. So now we're seeing a sense of empowerment that's coming along in Irish Chiclet. Which leads us to Watermelon by Marion Keyes. And this was written in 1995. So what's happening in 1995? I'm sure all of you heard of the Celtic tiger, right? And if you see, that's a picture of the Celtic tiger. There's a tiger on the side, and he's sitting on Ireland, and he's like, yay! Which is not the Celtic tiger anymore, by the way. Okay, so we had this huge expansion. in employment, and most of it was in women's employment. So women were being given a lot more roles in terms of money making in Ireland than ever before. We had 2 female presidents in the 1990s, which was huge. You can purchase contraception without a prescription in 1985. 1993 was the first time that they had like cigarette machines, but they were condom machines. They were on street corners, which is really bizarre. And as I was saying, so men can now be found guilty of raping their wives. And you can travel outside of the country to obtain an abortion. Prior to this, it was a criminal offense to do that, and you can be jailed for that. You could be jailed for just knowing that somebody was going to England to get an abortion. And divorce under specific conditions was legalized in 1996. Does anybody know what the conditions for divorce continue to be in Ireland? You have to have been married for 5 years and have lived apart for 4 of those years. That's yeah. Well, I don't think I would be able to deal with that. So the situation has really changed. Everything is really different. And if we think about the Ireland of 1960 versus the Ireland of 1995, it's an enormous sea change. And that is a relatively small amount of time for that to happen. And 35 years is a tiny, tiny amount of time for so many wide-ranging social changes to occur. And of course, we see this in Irish Chiclet. So this is Watermelon. And Watermelon is a book about a woman who is giving birth to her daughter. She's married, and right after she gives birth, her husband comes into the room and he says, "I'm leaving you. I'm having an affair with our neighbor. I'll see you later." And he leaves. She's like, okay, what do I do? What she does is, of course, she goes back to Ireland. She'd been living in England where all the bad things happen, right? And she goes back home to Ireland, and she goes back to her family, and she figures out who she is, and she ends up dumping the old husband, and she starts a romance with somebody else, and then she cuts it off with him, and in the end, she's strong, and she's happy, and she's positive. Okay? So it's remarkable to see where Irish heroines have come from 1960 to 1995. And we can see it all in the literature. Okay, so some of the things that are constants in all 3 that are just discourse conventions, I think, of Irish Chiclet are you're looking at the domestic, right? So we're looking at family life. We're looking at personal relationships. We're looking at what is my personal relationship with other people. Something that differentiates Irish women's literature from Irish male literature is there is never a direct discussion of politics in the way that other Irish men's literature has. So in Irish women's literature, the politics are on a personal level. It's about abortion. It's about domestic violence. It's about sexual rights. But in other Irish literature, male Irish literature, they'll talk about the IRA. They'll talk about Fianna Fáil. They'll talk about all kinds of huge governmental political things that are happening. But this is more concerned with the personal. Catholicism is a force in all of these. I think it's really cute. In light of, the Country Girls, there's a whole paragraph where Kathleen talks about this was the first time in her life that she hadn't gone to Sunday Mass. And that is something you'd only see in an Irish novel. Nobody else would care, right? Nobody else would be talking about that. But we see the same sort of thing happening in Light a Penny Candle, where when Elizabeth is in the town in Ireland, they keep trying to convert her to Catholicism, and she thinks it's really cute, and she goes through all the rituals. She gets baptized 3 times by the girls in her school. They take the water and do all the stuff. And she ends up not becoming Catholic, and she returns back for a visit, and the priest comes up to her and he says, "I'm just so disappointed. I don't know what I did wrong. Why couldn't we have you in our flock? Why didn't you become Catholic? It must not have been persuasive enough." So, yeah. And in the final one, in Watermelon, it's set in the 1990s, and Irish Mass participation had been up to 93% in the early 1990s, but it had dropped severely. So right now it's like at 57%. So in that book, the mother is getting on the case of the daughters because they're not going to church. And it's like every other chapter. When are you going to church? When are you going to Mass? When are you going to confession? You need to go to confession. You need to do this. This is a distinctly Irish phenomenon. Another thing, as we were talking about, there's good and bad families. Typically, the British families are the bad families. The Irish families are the good families. But even within Irish society, in these novels, there are good and bad families, and they're constantly commented on. So the Dunns are bad families, or the Kennys are good families, or these people are bad families, or these people are good families. One of the things that Maeve Binchy does over and over again is to show that these old school ideas of what bad and good are never correct. And it's always the caliber of the person that should determine if they're considered good or bad, not just the family name. And then they all have these unresolved endings, and the female is not really in a traditional pair bond. Now, you might say, in Light a Penny Candle, they have a pair bond because it's the two ladies in the end running off into the sunset, but they're not really together. They're like together, but they're not together. So I don't know if you can call that a traditional pair bond. The difference between the three, though, is this. In the first novel by Edna O'Brien, it's a tragedy. You're supposed to read it as a tragedy that she's not in a pair bond at the end. The second one, you're supposed to read it as empowerment. And the third one, you're supposed to read it as she's enlightened. She doesn't need to have anybody beside her anymore because she's strong enough in herself. Okay, so some of the negatives that I saw among all three were there are very abusive male figures, very neglectful male figures, and the mothers were really traumatized. Now it has to be that way because that's what's happening in Irish society, right? So we still have this very paternalistic attitude that's finally starting to make its way out, but it reflects itself in the literature, right? These crazy male love interests. And I was telling you about the weirdo, pedophile, creepy guy. In the second book, the men are horrible. And in the third book, the first husband who leaves his wife the day she gives birth is horrible, okay, just horrible. The truth is, this is not particular to Irish society. Women sometimes choose terrible choices, right? And they have to sort of walk through that in order to get to the right place in their lives where they can be with somebody who's normal, or they can be by themselves and be happy being by themselves. But it's very typical in Irish society for women to choose men who are very controlling. It's just a part of the society. And this is all about Catholic guilt. If any of you are Catholic, I don't even need to explain this to you, because this is how we live, okay? Like it is what it is. Okay. Okay, so one of the nice things is these books, all three of them, try to show the merit of female relationships and how female relationships can be healing and how they are sort of safe, sacred spaces for women. It also really shows women's voices and shows the importance of women's voices. So even though we have a character in The Country Girls that is downtrodden at the end, we're still seeing her story from her point of view, which gives her a voice in a way she wouldn't have in Irish society. So that's really important. And just by telling that story, you're able to see her lack of agency, that she had no alternatives, that she had nothing available to her, and it helps you appreciate that by the time we get to Watermelon, she takes agency, right? So we can see this continuum. Okay, so one of the things that I noticed is that these three books represent the different waves of feminism. So the first wave of feminism is when feminism was starting out, and the acknowledgement that there's something drastically wrong, that women were not being treated equally in the way that they should be, right? So that is directly represented in Kathleen's situation in The Country Girls, because she's victimized, she thinks of herself as a victim, she has no agency, she takes no agency, and she sort of has nothing to do, nowhere to go, nothing to do. However, then we move to the second wave of feminism, and this is sort of the burning your bra, which never really happened, by the way. It may have happened for one bra, but most people weren't doing that. But this book is so important because it's representing the idea that you don't need men, right? That you can be okay, that you can move beyond that, and it's okay. But the problem is we live in a society where men and women are both there, right? And we have to get to a place where you can coincide and live together. You can't just have female utopias. It doesn't work that way. And that is one of the big criticisms that current feminism has with the second wave of feminism. These ideas were sort of not all-encompassing. And when you are privileging one gender, you're still discriminating against another one, right? Which leads us to the third wave of feminism, which is more egalitarian, right? So it's not one is better than the other, it's both have to work together because you're in this together, right? Nobody's suggesting this one is privileged or that one is privileged, but it's trying to find stasis, trying to find a way for everybody to work together. So that's why this ending is so important, I think, because we have a situation where Claire figures out who she is, she figures out what her sense of self is, what her self-worth is, and then she finds somebody that she begins a friendship with. It isn't running into a romantic relationship right away. And then she's going to decide what she's going to do later on. Which when you're sane, that's what you do. But when you're in love and crazy, you don't think about that, right? So this is sort of like the best case scenario of a relationship. You can step back and that's what happens. All right, so why is this important? Why do I think this is important? Well, because I think there's so much happening in Irish society in such a short amount of time. Literature is always a snapshot of what's happening in a society at any given time. And so we can see the progression. It doesn't have to be great literature. It doesn't have to be something that you're going to puzzle over. It doesn't even have to be something that's going to be lasting for the next 20 years. But to be able to just take a look at it and see, okay, this is where we start from, and this is where it is in the middle, and this is where it is at the end, I think is important in and of itself. As I said, it's documenting women's lives at particular moments. And the thing I think that's really great about Chiclet is there's no candy coating, there's no happy ever after. It's showing you what could possibly be in a representation of somebody who would be alive at that time. Right? Okay, so one of the things also that's important is it isn't always happy, that sometimes you see the negative repercussions and how people are dealing with the messy parts of life, which is something that we all have to deal with, right? And through this whole thing, we've seen the movement from people who have no agency, who are victims, to people who become the heroes of their own lives, which I think is really important. And I think this is really, I love Michel Foucault. He's my favorite of anything. And he, in History of Sexuality, he talks about the power we give to things when we're not allowed to talk about them. And I think that's really important to think about in terms of this whole of Chiclet, of women in Irish society. There's so many things that these women were forced not to talk about, or to talk about in code, or not even to think about. And what happens with Irish Chiclet is it's finally giving voice to that which had been silenced before, right? So when you finally can talk about something, you totally change that conversation. And you create a space where things are safe and where you can talk about things that are really important, and you can change the world, right? So there it is. Okay, does anyone have any questions? We have 5 minutes for questions or more. Yeah, okay. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
You know the O'Phelan?
O'Phelan, yeah.
She writes, obviously, Chiclet, I'm thinking, but hers, is it fiction? Is it real?
Okay, so Nuala O'Phelan, I'm so glad that you brought her up. She started out as a column in the Irish Times, and she was writing just about things in her life. And she had a famous father. And then she started writing memoirs. So she writes primarily memoirs. And one of the things that she writes about in one of her memoirs is about how there is such a restriction on things that you can talk about in Irish society. And her mother was an alcoholic, and she was never able to talk about it. So if she would be at church and her mother would be home and people would say, you know, how's your mother? What's going on with your mother? They had these really inventive lies that they would say, oh, you know, she blah, 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 blah. Everybody knew that she was an alcoholic, but you can't talk about it, right? So there's a code of silence in Irish society that's starting to be broached, and that's why the breaking of the sex scandal in Ireland was so huge, and why talking about the industrial schools and what was happening in the Magdalen schools was huge, because it was sort of like all of the floodgates are breaking, and people are finally able to talk about all of these horrible things that have been happening. And I mean, the truth is that you can't really get healing until you can talk about things, right? So now we're moving to a point, well, okay, this is what's happened. Now in Irish society, it's almost like the floodgates are so open that you want them to shut, because there's a little bit too much coming out, right? So it's just everybody's telling their story, and there are all these memoirs, and there's all these things, and it's sort of like, I don't care about your cat in 2nd grade, it's okay, right? But you know, that's another process. That's a societal process. So they'll go through that stage, and then they'll get to where they can understand what's appropriate to talk about and what's not appropriate to talk about in certain times. But I think it's really exciting to be watching Ireland go through this process, because it's really, I think, it's really showing us the growth of this nation in a way that you hadn't seen before. Like it's been forced out. It's been a really painful process, but in the end, I think it's going to be really positive. Did I answer?
I think it's brought me quite a ways along.
Okay, good. Did anybody else have any other questions? Yeah.
Don't you think that we're still coping with that here?
Absolutely.
I remember when I was little, we didn't talk about if somebody's dad drank, or you didn't talk about any of this stuff. And now, everything's out in the open.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mom said a kid can't even do anything wrong without the police coming out. You know, it used to be you take care of things at home.
Right.
And there was a certain logic to that.
Right.
You know, but parents are afraid to really, you know, not even discipline their children reasonably.
Right. Right.
Because they can be accused of things.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
My
And
brother, the last years he taught, you know, he said, it used to be when the kids fell, he taught 5th and 6th grade. He says, I could put my arm around their shoulder and say, there you go.
yeah, you can't even do that
He says,
anymore.
I can't do that anymore.
Right.
And, you know,
And I'll tell you what, I was thinking to myself, okay, so I'm Irish American, but I'm more American than Irish, right? So why would I be so drawn to Ireland? Why would I want to study this, right? My whole life has been devoted to this, for so many different reasons. But I think one of the reasons that I'm really drawn to Ireland is because it's sort of like a microcosm of America, right? It's a little tiny, and because it's so small, you can note the changes better. America is so huge, and there's so many things going on at so many different points, it can be overwhelming. But in Ireland, because it's so small, you can really see the concentration of the changes. And it really is a mirror of what's happening in America. Sometimes they're ahead of us, sometimes they're behind us, but they're always sort of on the same continuum that we are. It's a great question. Anne?
The one shift that I've noticed just in the text that you talked about is that there seems to be a lightening of content, you know, like a lightening up or whatever. And it seems almost like there's a shift from like almost like a gothic, a female gothic kind of plot to something much sunnier.
Right.
And
Right.
And I mean, I'm gonna sound like such a sicko or something, but to me, in some isn't there something depoliticizing of that? Like in earlier point, instead of it being like a progress, could it also be in some ways like you could also even view it as like, I don't know, like
Well, I
You know
mean,
what I mean? Like, not that a darker critique or
Right.
laying bare of something necessarily means this is more truthful or
Right.
or deeper or more politicized. But in my mind, I kind of feel like maybe that is one of the ways to interpret it.
well, I mean, you have to remember that Irish Chiclet is divergent from Irish women's literature. It's a completely different animal. So Irish women's literature would move in the direction of Edna O'Brien and stay with those really super heavy topics, really gloom and doom, all of that stuff. So I think this is really political in a way because it's saying we don't care about that legacy of James Joyce. We're not worried about that anymore. We can do our own thing and that's okay, right? But as I was saying, what's happened since 1995 is that these seemingly frothy Chiclet novels have been going to really dark territory, really dark territory.
Even if there's still a formula, there are topics that get kind of introduced. Is there still the kind of Chiclet formula though, where there is a sort of optimism at the end? You know, when I
No.
think Chiclet, I think of like sunnier
Yeah.
topics. I think of like shopping and stuff. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, maybe it's more expansive
Right.
than I'm thinking about.
I would definitely say that Marian Keyes had been that way until she wrote a book in 1998 that was all about domestic abuse. And then it was, wow, like, whew. I think she sort of felt like I need to grow up and I need to take this to a different level. But one of the issues with that is your readership ready for that? Do you know what I mean? So they'll go along for the ride, but that doesn't mean that they're going to stay. So I think, you know, one of the genre characteristics of Irish Chiclet is the endings are uncertain, but they are optimistic, right? But it doesn't mean that everything's happy. It means that these people aren't going to kill themselves anymore.
Right.
You know what I mean?
It's female self-affirming as opposed to just like, let's look at the deep cavernous darkness that is the female self or something.
Right.
Right.
Now, there are lots of those. Lots of those.
Okay.
And I can give you a laundry list of authors that continue to do that. But I think it's important to look at this genre that is always dismissed by critics because you can really see the same sorts of progressions of what's happening in Irish society here just as you can in that heavier literature. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you.
Okay. This criticism against women in literature and Chiclets reminds me of this conversation we had in Women in the Art. It is kind of a parallelism with art.
Literature is art.
Sorry,
Sorry.
visual art. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
With visual art.
Right.
There was this woman painting. Historically, women have been put in a place where they are delegated as they cannot deal. They don't deal with the big issues. That's a male stereotype forced into women.
Mm-hmm.
They don't. A woman is nature. A man is politics and society,
Yeah.
and the big spectrum woman is more a house and small things. And,
Right.
and I was doing a criticism of that when we were discussing that point. That I was telling the class that women have been always drawn to emotion. Always have women have been doing emotional topics and things like that. And this other girl brought a really good point that she made me realize that I was as well just diminishing women's art by criticizing it in that way, just like everybody else was doing. Even if my criticism was the way they've been pushing to, they've been diminished. But the fact that they were painting things that related with them and their experience, and I felt that I was criticizing that and diminished their art, just like everybody else. Like it's been done. I think it's the same thing with literature. Women are writing about themselves, about their experience, and we're diminishing it when it shouldn't be diminished because it's still important, even if they are not dealing with the big issues still. That's still that stereotype. A male is good, a male is the big issues. If you want to be good, you gotta deal with the big issues.
Right. I think you're absolutely right. So it's that, yeah, I mean, it's that idea that the personal is political, right? And that's what these books are about. And that's what Jane Austen is about too, right? Like, the woman's world was considered boring by male authors, and that's why they didn't really go into it. They had to have these salacious things that happen. But women's lives are interesting. They are, right? Because it's your real experience, and you have to deal with things on a day-to-day basis. So the subject of watermelon, for example, which, you know, the title it's actually a really horrible title, because it's the title is the woman calling herself a watermelon because she's pregnant, and that nobody will love her and nobody will be around her because she's so fat. And a lot of the book talks about how she hates herself because she's so fat, and then all of a sudden she gets thin, and then she's desirable, and then she's fabulous. And it's hard to read that, but that's the truth in our society. That is the way women are made to feel, right? So you think, Jesus, you know, why are you having this idea about women in this book? Well, it's representation of a woman's real life and the way a woman really feels. So I think one of the reasons why people like to be dismissive of Chiclet is because there is that fantasy aspect to it that Anne had rightly discussed, right? But it's also super honest in a way that can be jarring, I think, because they make no, they don't try to sugarcoat anything, and they kind of throw things in your face in a way that can be uncomfortable, but funny, but uncomfortable. Right. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is it possible for a man to write Chiclet?
Okay, so there have been a couple of men that have written Chiclet for that very reason, because they feel like, well, you know, this is new and experimental, and I can do this. But the problem always comes down to authenticity of voice, right? I can't write like a man. I can't mirror that, because that's not my lived experience. So you can try to put that on, and you might get pretty far, but at some point in time, that mask is going to slip. And you can't help the way that you view the world, you know. And people will say nature, nurture, and, you know, societal versus biological, whatever. There are still things that men see that women don't see. There are still things women see that men don't see. And it comes out. Literature, writing can't lie. It comes out in the literature. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think if they did, they had to have at least 3 sisters.
Yeah.
Okay. Nicholas Sparks kind of raised Chiclets.
Oh, Nicholas Sparks. Okay, so Nicholas Sparks, I think, would be the closest thing to a Chiclet, male Chiclet writer.
But he does it well.
He does do it well, but even within that, like, for example, in the Notebook, it's still from a male privileged position, right? So it isn't coming from the wife who is incapacitated. It's coming from the husband who is writing a story about his wife. Do you see what I'm saying? So with Chiclet, it's usually from the perspective of the woman, and everything comes through her worldview, right? So Nicholas Sparks, I think he's the closest to it, but it still slips.
That's right. It's still
Right.
I was going to say, don't you think that's why women like reading Chiclets and going to Chiclets
Absolutely.
more than men do? Because
Absolutely.
it's about and they can maybe relate more to it.
Absolutely.
As much as, you know, some men want to read, you know, murder mysteries, or I don't know.
Or war movies, or, yeah, right.
Women who read those too, but I mean,
Yeah.
But I just have a quick question.
Sure.
Well, my family went to Ireland in 2001, and I'm quite sure the man who was doing the tour when we went on a day trip said that at that time there were, I thought he said there were 2 million people in Ireland, and 1 million of them lived in Dublin, and the other 1 million lived in the rest of the country. And I think it's more like 4 million now, 2 million in Dublin and
So the entire country.
Half the population lived in Dublin and around the surrounding area of Dublin, and the other half of the population of the country lived all around the rest of the country, which it isn't a very big country. But
Right. There are 6 million people in Ireland,
so then maybe
but there's
million.
the majority are concentrated around Dublin. And one of the issues in Irish society right now is because of the Celtic Tiger, the land prices in Dublin were huge. And so people were selling all of their possessions, and then a lot of immigrants were coming in. So what we have now is in Dublin, the majority of the population is immigrant population. They're not native Irish, and it's causing a huge problem, particularly since we're not in Celtic Tiger Ireland anymore. So the Irish people feel like they're being displaced, and it's a big conflict. But I mean, the truth is Dublin is big, right? It's the biggest city in Ireland, and Galway is the second. But Galway is sort of the more like, oh, let's go and ring-a-ding-ding and sing country songs and, like that sort of thing. So, but the largest concentration of people is around Dublin and the surrounding environs like Dunleary and Howth and all of those areas. But that's going to be the next iteration in Irish literature, talking about all of those problems in terms of, it's starting to come out now. I mean,
The music
how
is
does
starting
it
to show.
affect of the new societal changes? Do you think that they happen more quickly in the Dublin area than out in tiny little
yes.
villages and towns? That's
Yes.
typical of any society.
Yes. And in fact, that's what the Country Girls is about. That's why she has to go to Dublin, because that's where all the things happen to all the people, right? So she can wear a black bra in Dublin, but she can only wear a white one in the country, right? So yeah.
Still like that you're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I don't know how much you'll love it, but yeah, okay. Yeah, so might love it. Might love it. Might love it. Just prepare yourself for the creepy. Yeah, well, there's a lot of them. Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions? Great. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.